Autumn 1944, Nebraska, United States. The war was still burning across the world when the train rolled into Nebraska. Europe was ash and thunder. The ruins of Stalingrad still smoked, and the beaches of Normandy were soaked in blood and salt. But here, in the vast stillness of America's heartland, the only sound was the wind brushing through dry corn stalks and the low whistle of a locomotive cutting across the plains. For years, the men on that train had lived inside the noise of war. Artillery, engines, orders barked through static. Now, as the brakes hissed and the train groaned to a stop beside an endless field of gold, silence fell so suddenly that it frightened them. Klaus Becker pressed his forehead to the window. He was 22, a former Wehrmacht private from Hamburg who had been captured near Tunis. The last image he remembered of Europe was dust, smoke, and the smell of burnt oil. He had spent 3 months in transit, first in a crowded prison camp in North Africa, then across the Atlantic in a Liberty ship that reeked of diesel and sweat, and finally through a blur of American cities whose size defied reason. Now the doors opened, and Nebraska sunlight poured in like a flood. The first step onto American soil felt unreal. The ground wasn't cratered or blackened. It was firm, dry, sweet with the smell of grass. The guards shouted short orders, but not cruelly. "Move along, boys. Grab your packs." Their accents were strange, long, rounded vowels that sounded almost musical. Klaus blinked against the brightness. Beyond the barbed wire, he saw a horizon so wide it hurt the eyes. The sky seemed too large for the earth beneath it. Wooden barns dotted the distance like ships on a calm sea. There were no ruins here, no rubble, no fear. He turned to the man beside him, another prisoner from Bremen. "Is this America?" he whispered. The other man nodded, speechless. They had been told so many things, that the Americans were barbarians, that capture meant humiliation, starvation, maybe worse, yet the air smelled of harvest, not death. A truck waited on the dirt road beyond the platform. Painted on its side in thick white letters were the words U.S. Army Service Corps. But beside the truck stood a man who was no soldier. His hat wide-brimmed, his sleeves rolled, his face bronzed by sun and labor. A farmer. He spat into the dust, adjusted his belt, and regarded the line of German prisoners as if he were inspecting a shipment of tools. "You boys ever pick corn?" he asked through a translator. No one answered. The farmer shrugged. "You'll learn." It was not what they expected to hear from their conquerors. By the autumn of 1944, America had become an industrial miracle. Its factories thundered day and night, producing bombers, tanks, and trucks at a pace the world had never seen. Millions of men fought overseas, and millions more women filled the assembly lines back home. The Great Depression was over, replaced by unity and purpose. People prayed together, worked together, and believed, fiercely, that their cause was just. And while soldiers died in Europe and the Pacific, a quieter front had formed within America's own borders, the prisoner of war camps. More than 400,000 Axis captives, most of them German, were scattered across 46 states. To the American public, it was an invisible war. To the prisoners, it was the beginning of something unimaginable. Camp Geneva lay just beyond the town of Hastings, a neat grid of barracks surrounded by wire and watchtowers. But even from the outside, it looked less like a prison and more like a small, orderly village. Whitewashed walls, trimmed lawns, a chapel, even a baseball diamond. As the Germans disembarked, they looked around in disbelief. The fences were high, yes, but the guards carried their rifles loosely, as if they were an afterthought. Inside the mess hall, the smell of food drifted through the open doors. bread, coffee, something frying. Klaus felt his stomach twist. He hadn't eaten properly in days. They lined up, metal trays in hand, still braced for cruelty. Instead, a cook in an apron smiled and ladled stew onto each plate. "Welcome to Nebraska," he said in careful German. "Eat up." It was such a simple gesture that it felt wrong. Klaus stared at the stew. Potatoes, carrots, chunks of beef swimming in gravy. Real meat. He waited for the guard to snatch it away or mock him. No one did. He took a bite. The warmth hit his tongue, and for the first time in years, he tasted comfort. Around him, others hesitated, then ate in silence. No one spoke. A few stared at their trays with wet eyes, as if unsure whether to trust them. That night in the barracks, Klaus couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his cot, listening to the sound of wind rattling the tin roof. Outside, the prairie stretched into darkness, vast and unknowable. He thought of home, of his mother's kitchen before the war, of the smell of bread rising in the oven. He thought of his father, killed in a British air raid. He thought of all the things he'd been told, that Americans were soft, decadent, without discipline or pride. But what he saw that day didn't fit any of it. He looked around the barracks. The other prisoners had fallen asleep, their faces relaxed for the first time in years. No one shouted. No one feared the door bursting open. There was order here, yes, but not the kind forged by terror. The next morning, he awoke to the sound of a bugle. The guards moved through the camp with calm efficiency, calling roll. Breakfast was served. Oatmeal, bread, jam, and coffee so strong it made his hands shake. Afterward, they were herded onto trucks and driven out into the countryside. The road wound through miles of farmland, fields so vast that even the horizon seemed to bend under their weight. Cornfields shimmered in the sun. Cattle grazed lazily near fences that stretched, farther than any he had ever seen. Everything was larger here, the land, the sky, even the silence. When the truck stopped, the farmer from the day before was waiting. He pointed to a row of tools leaning against a fence. "You're gonna help with the harvest," he said through the interpreter. "You work, you eat, you make trouble, you go back behind the wire." It was a simple bargain. Klaus nodded. Work meant purpose, and purpose meant survival. He picked up a sack and followed the farmer into the field. The earth was dry and fragrant beneath his boots. He worked until his back ached, the sun burning through his thin shirt. At midday, the farmer's wife came down the path carrying a jug of water and a basket of bread. She set it on the ground without a word, just nodded for them to eat. Klaus reached for a slice, hesitant. The bread was soft, still warm from the oven. He looked up at the woman. She couldn't have been more than 40. Her hair tied in a kerchief, her face weathered but kind. Their eyes met for a moment and she smiled. A small, tired smile, but real. He didn't know what to do with it. In that smile was something no speech or radio broadcast could explain. Decency, uncalculated and unashamed. By sunset, the fields glowed amber, and the air smelled of hay and smoke. The trucks returned to the camp. As they passed through the gate, Klaus turned in his seat and looked back. The farmer stood by the fence, hat in hand, watching them go. For a moment, the world seemed divided not by enemies or nations, but by fences built of misunderstanding. That night, in the dim light of the barracks, Klaus wrote a few words in his diary, a scrap of paper hidden in his boot since North Africa. "This country is not what we were told. The people are not monsters. They live in a land too rich for hatred." He folded the note and tucked it away, unsure whether it was hope or heresy. Outside, the prairie wind swept over the camp, carrying the faint smell of harvest into the night. And for the first time since he'd worn a uniform, Klaus Becker felt something that terrified him even more than defeat. He felt peace. The barracks creaked in the wind. Thin moonlight spilled through cracks in the wood, tracing pale lines across the sleeping faces of men who no longer knew which world they belonged to. Klaus Becker lay awake, listening to the low hum of a radio from the guardhouse outside. A trumpet flared, followed by the rhythm of drums, jazz, smooth and alive. Then came a voice in English, cheerful and casual, like a man talking to his neighbors rather than to the enemies he was guarding. Klaus did not understand the words, but the tone unsettled him. No rage, no triumph, just ordinary calm. He turned on his cot and whispered, "Do you hear that?" The man beside him grunted, half asleep. Music, American music. Klaus stared at the ceiling. They play music while we lie here. Who does that for prisoners? No one answered. The question was too strange to touch. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. In the darkness, he remembered the voice of his old sergeant back in North Africa, rasping through the desert wind. If captured, they'll starve you. They'll treat you like animals. Better to die than fall into their hands. That had been the creed drilled into every soldier. Surrender was worse than death. To die for the Reich was honorable. To live as a prisoner was betrayal. Yet here he was, alive, fed, unbeaten. It didn't make sense. Before the war, the Ministry of Propaganda had filled Germany with stories about America. Posters showed a mongrel nation of jazzmen, Jews, and weak-blooded men without discipline. Radio broadcasts described American soldiers as lazy and decadent, unable to fight without machines. In training camps, officers told recruits that captivity meant humiliation, that Americans were racially impure, morally corrupt, and spiritually empty. For years, Klaus believed it all. He was raised on it. Everyone was. You didn't question the Reich. You simply absorbed its truths like the air you breathed. Now, those truths were cracking. He remembered the first time he saw an American up close, an infantry corporal who had captured him outside Tunis. The man had freckles, a calm gaze, and a soft Oklahoma drawl. He had offered Klaus water. Water. A luxury in the desert. Klaus had refused at first, convinced it was a trick, but thirst had a way of crushing ideology. That small act haunted him even now. Morning came with blinding light and the scent of coffee. The camp stirred to life like a small town. Guards moved between buildings checking lists. Some laughed, trading jokes. The prisoners stood at roll call squinting against the sun, expecting barked orders, insults, maybe the butt of a rifle. Instead, the sergeant in charge spoke with measured patience. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said, his accent flat and unmistakably American. "Breakfast at 6:30. Work assignments at 7. Anyone sick, report to the medic. Questions." A silence followed. Then one prisoner raised his hand, hesitant. "When do we get interrogated?" he asked in halting English. The sergeant frowned. "Interrogated? That's already done. You're here to wait out the war, not to suffer." He moved on, clipboard under his arm, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Klaus stared after him. In Germany, prisoners were beaten for less than asking a question. The mess hall was alive with the sound of dishes clattering and men talking softly in German. Steam rose from pots on the serving line. The smell was intoxicating. Coffee, fried eggs, toast. The cooks moved with professional rhythm, flipping, pouring, serving. They wore aprons, not uniforms. Klaus took his tray and followed the line. When his turn came, a cook ladled scrambled eggs onto his plate and smiled. "Eat up, soldier. You'll need it for the fields. Soldier, not enemy, not animal." He sat at a table with 3 others, men from his old unit. For a while, no one spoke. They just ate, slowly, silently. The man across from him, Otto, looked up and said, "Do you think this is real?" "What do you mean?" "This food, this treatment. It can't last. They'll show their true faces soon." Klaus shrugged. "Maybe." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure. The eggs were real. The bread was warm. The coffee scalded his tongue. Outside, through the open window, he could see the stars and stripes fluttering against the pale sky. The flag moved lazily, unconcerned with the men beneath it. That afternoon, they were led to a field surrounded by wire. A game was already in progress. Soccer. 2 teams of Germans in worn uniforms, cheered on by a crowd of fellow prisoners and even a few guards. Klaus stopped to watch, incredulous. A sergeant noticed him. "You play?" Klaus hesitated, then nodded. "Go on, then. We don't mind who wins." The field was uneven, the ball half flat, but for the first time since the war began, he felt the rush of movement, the old rhythm of freedom. The guards watched but didn't interfere. Some even clapped when a goal was scored. When the game ended, the sergeant tossed the ball to a prisoner and said, "Good match." Then he walked away. No speeches, no propaganda. Just a simple acknowledgement that men were men. That night Klaus wrote in his diary again. "The camp has showers. Real showers, soap, towels. There's even a library. They say we can borrow books. How can this be? Have they no hatred?" He stopped writing. The question lingered like a wound. Days passed. The camp ran with machine-like precision. Breakfast at 6, work details by 7. Letters censored and delivered weekly. Even pay, small chits redeemable at the canteen, where prisoners could buy cigarettes, chocolate, paper, even stamps. One afternoon, Klaus walked past the library. The shelves were lined with donated books, Dickens, Twain, Steinbeck. A sign above the door read, "Education Program for Prisoners of War, U.S. Army." He stared at it for a long time, unable to process what it meant. A young guard noticed him and called out, "You like to read?" Klaus nodded cautiously. "Come on in. Just don't take the books home. We've only got a few." Inside, the air smelled of paper and dust. He ran his fingers along the spines of books he could barely read, their titles embossed in gold. He pulled one out at random. The Grapes of Wrath. The guard chuckled. "That one's about farmers. You might like it." Klaus opened the first page and traced the English words with his finger, whispering their sound. He didn't understand most of it, but one word caught his eye again and again. Family. Later that week, a new batch of prisoners arrived. Men from the Italian front, gaunt and sullen. They brought stories of hunger and brutality, of Russian camps where men froze in their sleep. When they saw the Nebraska compound, they thought it was a trick. "Where are the cages?" one asked. "There are none," Klaus replied. The man laughed bitterly. "Then you are still dreaming." Klaus said nothing. He remembered that he too had thought the same. At dusk, the prisoners gathered near the fence for fresh air. Across the wire, the lights of a small American town twinkled in the distance. They could hear faint music drifting from a radio somewhere. Swing, laughter, maybe a baseball game. The normalcy of it was unbearable. Otto stood beside Klaus, staring at the horizon. "They live like this while our families starve," he said. Klaus didn't answer. The truth was too heavy to carry. He thought of his mother again, of the last letter he had received before being shipped to Africa. She had written that the rationing had grown worse, that the city smelled of smoke and fear. And here he was, in the enemy's land, eating meat and bread, surrounded by abundance. A wave of shame crept over him. That night a storm rolled over the plains. Rain lashed the roof, wind howled through cracks, and thunder rumbled like artillery. The men woke in panic, shouting in their sleep, ducking for cover. For a few minutes the barracks became a battlefield again. Klaus sat up, gasping. His heart hammered in his chest. The smell of wet wood filled the air. A guard burst in, holding a lantern. "Easy, it's just weather," he shouted. "You're safe." Safe. The word echoed in Klaus's head like something he hadn't heard in years. When the storm passed, silence returned. The air cooled, and the prairie outside shimmered with rain. Klaus lay back on his cot, staring at the ceiling beams glistening with moisture. He tried to hold on to his fear, to remind himself that these people were enemies. But the evidence kept slipping away. The guards spoke softly. The food was good, the air smelled of rain and corn, not gunpowder. His mind rebelled against it. "They said the Americans were beasts," he wrote, "but the beasts give us coffee and books. I don't know what to believe anymore." In Washington, policymakers spoke of the Geneva Convention, a promise that civilized nations kept even in war. The United States would treat prisoners as it hoped its own soldiers would be treated. For every German fed and clothed, an American held in Europe might gain one more chance to live. But in the camp, the prisoners didn't see strategy. They only saw decency. And that was far more dangerous to everything they'd been taught. As the lights dimmed that night, Klaus heard the radio again, faint through the rain. A swing melody floated through the dark, slow and melancholy. He didn't understand the lyrics, but the rhythm spoke of something impossible. Joy in a time of war. He closed his eyes and whispered the only truth he could grasp. If this is the enemy, then the war has already been lost. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the fences, America slept, calm, confident, untouched, while the men inside the wire lay awake, trying to understand how a nation could fight with such power and still have mercy left to spare. By the summer of 1944, the war had drained America's young men from its fields. Across Nebraska, Kansas, and Iowa, farmhouses stood half empty. Sons were overseas in uniform. Daughters and wives worked dawn to dusk trying to keep the harvest alive. What had once been a season of abundance had turned into a season of exhaustion. That was when the army trucks began arriving, bringing not reinforcements, but the captured enemy. German POWs stepped down into the heart of America, still stunned by how quiet it was here. There were no sirens, no ruins, no hunger. The land seemed untouched by the catastrophe that had swallowed Europe. Rows of golden corn shimmered in the sun. Silos rose like monuments, and the smell of cut hay hung sweet and heavy in the air. At first, the farmers watched the newcomers warily. They had lost sons to this war. They'd seen the newsreels, Nazi rallies, swastikas, soldiers marching in perfect lines, and yet, standing in front of them now were not monsters, but thin, tired young men who could barely lift their tools. The first days were awkward. The Germans worked in silence, eyes lowered, never speaking unless spoken to. They feared traps in every kindness. When the farmer's wife offered them lemonade at noon, they didn't dare drink it. When she smiled, they looked away. But America had its own stubborn way of doing good. Klaus Becker worked on the Meyer farm 20 miles outside Hastings. The farm stretched farther than his village back in Germany. fields of corn rippling like an ocean under the wind. Every morning he was trucked in with a small group of prisoners under the watch of one army guard who rarely carried his rifle. Mr. Meyer was a man of few words. He was in his 50s, with hands like weathered wood and a limp from an old tractor accident. His oldest boy was fighting somewhere in France. His youngest, barely 16, was learning to milk cows and run machinery. His wife, Eleanor, ran the kitchen like a command post. At first, she didn't speak to the prisoners at all. But one hot afternoon, when the men were mending fences and the sun beat down mercilessly, she came walking down the dirt road carrying a galvanized bucket filled with cold water and tin cups. "Drink," she said, setting it down. The men hesitated. She noticed, frowned slightly, and took a sip herself before stepping back. Only then did they move forward. Klaus filled his cup, lifted it to his lips, and felt the shock of cold water cut through the heat. "Danke," he murmured. She nodded, not understanding the word but recognizing its tone. "You're welcome," she said softly, then turned and walked back to the house. That evening, as the truck rattled, away from the farm, Klaus watched her silhouette in the doorway. Something in her bearing reminded him of his mother. Strong, quiet, practical. It was a sight that stayed with him through the night. Sunday came. The prisoners expected another workday, but when they arrived at the farm, Meyer was waiting at the gate in a clean shirt and a straw hat. "No work today," he said. "Sabbath." They nodded, unsure what to do. He looked at them for a long moment, chewing his tobacco. Then he spoke again, as if deciding something in that instant. "We're having dinner after church," he said. "Tell the boys to come eat." For a moment, no one understood. The interpreter repeated it in German. "Dinner?" Klaus asked quietly. "Yes," Meyer said. "Dinner. Food." The prisoners exchanged glances, uncertain whether they had misheard. "You mean, with you?" one of them asked in halting English. Meyer simply nodded, turned toward his truck, and added, "Don't keep Eleanor waiting. She's cooking for an army." By late afternoon, the sun hung low, turning the fields to gold. The smell of roast chicken drifted from the farmhouse, carried on the wind. The prisoners were driven to the Meyer place in 2 trucks. They climbed down hesitantly, their boots crunching on the gravel drive. Inside, the dining table had been extended to its full length. There were chairs pulled from every room, mismatched but sturdy. Eleanor moved briskly between the kitchen and the table, setting down platters of food, roast chicken glistening with butter, bowls of mashed potatoes, sweet corn swimming in cream, biscuits still steaming. Meyer stood at the head of the table, hat in hand. "Find a seat," he said. "You've all worked hard. It's time to eat." The prisoners hesitated on the threshold. They looked at one another, waiting for a command that never came. The guard, leaning against the doorframe, shrugged. "Go on," he said. "You heard the man." They entered slowly, almost reverently, as if stepping into a church. Klaus found himself seated across from the Meyer boy, a lanky teenager with sunburned arms. The boy stared at him openly, curious rather than hostile. Eleanor appeared with a pitcher of milk. "You boys like milk?" she asked. No one replied. She poured it anyway. "Well, you'll learn to." A moment later, Meyer cleared his throat. Everyone fell silent. He bowed his head, and his deep, gravelly voice filled the room. "Bless the food, and bless those far from home," he said. "And may this war end soon, so all men can see each other as brothers again." When he finished, there was a pause. The words hung in the air like a benediction. Then the scraping of forks began, slow and tentative. For the first few minutes, the prisoners ate in silence. Then, gradually, conversation began to flow. Not between guards and prisoners, but between people. The Meyer boy pointed at Klaus's plate. "You eat chicken in Germany?" he asked. Klaus nodded. "Yes, but not like this." The boy grinned. "My mama's the best cook in Nebraska." Eleanor gave a small snort from the kitchen. "Flattery won't save you from dishes, Billy." Laughter rippled around the table, light and contagious. For the first time in months, Klaus felt his shoulders unclench. He took another bite, chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, and felt something break open inside him. The taste was overwhelming. Salt, warmth, memory. He swallowed hard, suddenly afraid he might cry. Across the table, Eleanor noticed. She said nothing, just refilled his cup with milk. Outside, twilight settled over the plains. The children, neighbors who had come to join the meal, ran in the yard chasing fireflies, their laughter carrying through the open windows. Inside, the adults lingered at the table, talking about weather, harvests, and rumors from the front. The prisoners listened, catching bits of English they understood, words like home, family, Thanksgiving. At one point, Meyer looked at the German men and said, "My eldest is somewhere near the Rhine. Maybe one of you saw him." The room went still. "No," Klaus said softly. "We never reached the Rhine." Meyer nodded, accepting the answer without bitterness. "Then maybe he's the one guarding you next time," he said with a faint smile. The tension eased. When the plates were cleared, Eleanor brought out a pie. Its crust was golden, the filling deep red. "Apple," she said simply. "We had a good year." She cut slices for everyone, even the prisoners. The first bite nearly undid them. The sweetness, the cinnamon, the sheer homeness of it. One man closed his eyes and murmured, "It tastes like before the war." Eleanor didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. "Then, you're welcome," she said quietly. Later, as the meal ended, the prisoners helped carry dishes to the kitchen. Eleanor protested, but they insisted. Klaus stood beside her at the sink, rinsing plates while she dried them. "You don't have to," she said. He searched for the right English. "We want to. It is respect." She looked at him then. Really looked. His hands were rough, his face sunburned, his eyes tired but clear. For the first time she saw not a soldier, not an enemy, but someone's son. When all the dishes were stacked, Klaus turned to her and said quietly, "Thank you." She hesitated, then touched his arm lightly. "We all just do what we can," she said. "War ends, but people stay." The drive back to camp was silent. The men sat in the truck bed, the night wind cool against their faces. No one spoke. Each was lost in the same confusion, how to reconcile what they had been told with what they had seen. When they reached the gate, the guard checked his watch. "You boys get a good meal?" he asked. Klaus nodded. "Good," he said, his English slow but certain. "Good. America." The guard chuckled. "It's just supper, son." But for Klaus, it was more than supper. It was an earthquake. In his bunk that night, he lay awake long after lights out. The air still smelled faintly of roasted chicken. The sound of laughter echoed in his mind. He pulled out his diary and wrote by the faint light of a match. "Today, we ate with the Americans. They prayed before the meal, even for us. The food was good, but the kindness was better. I do not understand this country." He paused, listening to the faint hum of crickets outside. "Maybe," he added, "God listens to them too." He blew out the match and lay in darkness. Beyond the camp, the farmhouse lights glowed warm against the night. Somewhere inside, the Meyer family was saying their own prayers, one for their son overseas, and one, perhaps unspoken, for the strangers they had fed that day. And as the wind whispered across the Nebraska plains, Klaus realized that the fences no longer looked quite so tall. The world, he thought, had begun to widen. The next Sunday, the invitation came again. The Meyer family had decided that if the German boys worked their land, they could share their table. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. At first, some prisoners refused to go. It felt shameful to sit and eat with the people whose sons were killing theirs overseas. But hunger and curiosity have their own logic, and by dusk nearly a dozen men climbed into the back of the truck, their faces tight with unease. Klaus was among them. He had not slept since the last dinner, haunted by its simplicity, the warmth, the prayer, the laughter that had sounded almost holy. He told himself it was a mistake to go again, that he was already losing something he didn't understand. But when the truck stopped at the farm and he smelled roast meat drifting through the open windows, he followed the others inside. The table was set larger this time. The Meyers had invited neighbors, 2 other families whose husbands were away at war. Children darted around the kitchen chasing a dog that barked with delight. A record played softly in the background, the scratchy sound of Bing Crosby singing, "I'll Be Seeing You." The prisoners stood awkwardly near the door, their caps in their hands. Meyer waved them in. "No standing tonight," he said. "You worked enough this week." Klaus sat near the end of the table beside a man named Hans, who had been captured at Anzio. Hans hadn't spoken much since their capture. His eyes always looked far away. Tonight he stared at the food as though it might vanish if he blinked. Eleanor brought out the main dish, beef roast with potatoes and gravy, and set it at the center. "We had a steer ready," she said. "You boys helped feed it. You might as well help eat it." The joke drew a few polite smiles. They began to eat. Forks clicked softly against plates. Steam rose in delicate spirals. For several minutes, the only sounds were chewing and the murmur of children at the far end of the table. Then Hans's hands began to tremble. He tried to steady his fork, but it clattered against the plate. His eyes filled suddenly as if some invisible dam inside him had cracked. Klaus leaned toward him. "Was es los?" he whispered. Hans shook his head violently, muttering in German, "It's too much. It's too much." The room quieted. Everyone turned to look. Hans pushed back his chair and stood, his voice breaking through the stillness. "Why?" he said, his accent thick. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor froze mid-step. Meyer looked up slowly from his plate. Hans's face was pale, streaked with tears. "You feed us like family," he said. "You pray for us. You smile at us. Why? We are your enemies. My country bombed yours. We killed your sons." No one spoke. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. Finally, Meyer set down his fork and met Hans's eyes. "Because men ought to eat," he said simply, "and war doesn't change that." The words hung in the air, heavy and unadorned. Hans covered his face with his hands and wept. The sound was raw, unrestrained. Not the quiet shame of a soldier defeated, but the deep sobbing of a man whose world had collapsed. Klaus felt something break inside him too. The propaganda, the pride, the years of training. It all began to dissolve under the unbearable weight of kindness. Eleanor moved quietly to Hans's side. Without a word, she placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a gesture so small, yet it struck everyone like a thunderclap. In another world, this woman's son and Hans might have faced each other across a battlefield. Here, she comforted him as if he were her own. The other prisoners sat frozen, their eyes lowered, their throats tight. Meyer cleared his throat. "Sit down, son," he said gently. "Finish your supper. It'll get cold." Hans obeyed. He sat, wiped his face with his sleeve, and ate in silence. For the rest of the meal, no one spoke. Only the sound of clinking plates and quiet breathing filled the room. When it was over, Meyer stood and said grace again, short, unadorned, the same words as before. "Bless this house, and bless those far from home." Hans bowed his head and whispered the words under his breath in German. That night, a storm gathered over the plains.